Today, I want to talk to you about the very frequently asked question when parents arrive to this moment of doubt. They're being told from an orthodontist that their child needs teeth pulled. And let's dive into this topic. First things first, this distinction of whether we're talking about adult teeth or baby teeth is really important. Sometimes orthodontists do remove baby teeth to help adult teeth come into place more easily. The normal process as a permanent tooth is developing, it's going to slowly dissolve or kind of nibble away at the root of the baby tooth that's in the position or place where it needs to arrive. So I've got kind of this little Pac-Man visual for easy comparison. What happens is once that root is nibbled away, the baby tooth gets loose, it falls out, and the bigger adult tooth erupts into that place. So exfoliation is just the fancy term for it. You hear it, sometimes you hear about skin exfoliation. This is tooth exfoliation, the process where that is sort of shed, the baby teeth are sort of shed. And because the adult tooth is a bigger tooth than the baby tooth in most situations, it's actually part of why we anticipate that we should be seeing space between the baby teeth. And so what can happen is if the jaws aren't growing enough to actually naturally have this buffer space between the baby teeth, crowding can start early. And so even what we might think of as what looks normal, it doesn't look too crowded, is sometimes an early sign of crowding. And so the developing adult tooth, it sometimes will have no choice but to move or shift due to that crowding. And it can result in coming into the mouth out of place instead of where it was designed, the natural design of our body would place it. It's now going to come out in sort of like a second row behind the baby teeth, or maybe it will be kind of blocked out entirely and it doesn't have a good path to enter into the mouth. And that's where sometimes in these situations, pulling the baby tooth out can create an open pathway or a sort of channel to allow that tooth to come into position more easily. When this is recommended, it should be part of a larger orthodontic plan, something that's going to support jaw development like expansion. And it's very rare that removing the baby tooth alone is going to be all that's needed to resolve the underlying space issue. So for many years, orthodontic treatment often focused on the primary goal of making the teeth fit within the existing size of the jaws. If there wasn't enough room, then what was proposed was to go ahead and remove a few of the teeth. So let's say anything with an X on it, X marks the spot, we're going to pull that tooth, and then we're going to tuck the remaining teeth in to make sure that everything lines up properly. And this approach is called retraction orthodontics. It's reducing the number of teeth, bringing things backwards closer together so that everything fits within the available space. And the reason for this that dentists admit often is that the goal is to avoid pushing the teeth outside of the supporting bone. So if we do nothing and if we leave everything in place, oftentimes the bone that's around these teeth, it's going to be at a higher risk for kind of what we call recession or bone loss around these teeth. So right then and there, we're already acknowledging that the bone hasn't developed correctly. That's part of our motivation why this was recommended in the first place, that we consider pulling some of these teeth. Today, instead, some providers are going to approach this problem differently. So instead of asking the question of how can we make the teeth fit to the jawbone, we're going to flip that and we're going to ask instead, how can we help the jaw grow large enough so that it can support all of the teeth without having to pull any? And this approach is going to be called more expansion orthodontics. This is going to focus on creating more space by supporting better jaw development rather than pulling teeth. Expansion is not always going to be appropriate for every child, but it can be very helpful, especially while children are still growing. And beyond that, it is important to know that expansion options are available at any age, not only for children. A sort of side commentary to this is that I don't necessarily feel that expanders are the only way to get expansion. There are different ways to get expansion with tools like Invisalign and braces, but this is more of making sure that a provider is practicing with an expansion philosophy is a key piece here. Talk about why we're hesitant to pull teeth in the first place. And let's talk about the research. There are definitely people who claim online that removing teeth causes breathing problems later in life. And while I do generally agree with this sentiment, it is a topic of heavy debate within dentistry still. As of this year, 2026, the American Academy of Orthodontists still states that there's not enough evidence to directly prove that orthodontic extractions directly cause airway obstruction. So you'll see there are a number of people who will say, we pull these teeth out, we shove everything back in that retractive way that I was just talking about, and people now have sleep apnea. So the research by these reviews has come in to say that we can't show directly that pulling the teeth is the cause of the breathing problems. However, with that in mind, while we can't necessarily say extractions cause sleep apnea, we can look at the fact that often in the case where extractions are being recommended, it's a situation where the jaws have not developed large enough to fit all of the teeth. And so that's going to raise some further questioning. What else might be affected when the jaw bones themselves are smaller than expected? There's a lot of research that's ongoing to better understand the role that dentistry can play in preventing or helping to manage some of these breathing problems, either as a standalone treatment, dentistry treatments on their own, or as part of a broader treatment approach. So that research I mentioned, what are we finding? First, it's just important to understand that the jaws do hold more than the teeth. They also form the structure around the nose, the nasal passage, and the upper airway. So that upper jawbone called the maxilla, it's the same bone. The roof of the mouth is the floor of the nose. And what researchers have found is that many children today are developing more narrow upper jawbones than previous generations. There's a lot at play here, modern lifestyle factors, our diets, our oral habits, the way that we're breathing has shifted. There's a lot that contributes to this. But when the upper jaw develops more narrow or more highly arched, it can be linked with other structural differences. For example, research has found a strong association between narrow palates and deviated nasal septums, which can interfere with comfortable nasal breathing. So a lot of times when you hear the word a nasal septum, a deviated septum, it's this bone here. I've got these three little arrows that are pointing to this bone that runs through the middle of the nose. And you can see down below in the kind of skull that's directly facing you, there's like a single string line that goes through there. And what happens is when the roof of the mouth is pushed up, it's high, it's narrow, a lot of times there's crowding of the teeth, but there's also crowding of the anatomy within the nose. And so previously, a lot of times the term a deviated nasal septum was attributed to someone who broke their nose or had some sort of trauma early on. But we're also understanding that outside of some of these expected trauma cases, just the fact that they're having these high narrow arches and high narrow roof of the mouth can be associated strongly. Studies also show us that in examining sleep disordered breathing, there are different facial growth patterns that we tend to see. that narrow upper jaw, an upper jawbone that is poorly positioned relative to the lower jawbone. So think of things like an overbite or underbite, and that we might think of as something like a gummy smile. So there's a 2026 research review that went through a kind of a broad look at the research that's available, and it noted that treatments aimed at guiding jaw growth may improve airflow and support normal craniofacial development. We also see that certain jaw features have been linked with more obstructive sleep apnea or severe obstructive sleep apnea in adults. So again, those characteristics might be a narrow distance between the back teeth, those molars, and a higher, more vaulted palate. These traits were associated with higher sleep apnea scores in clinical studies. Beyond all this, we also understand that dentistry can play a role in actually increasing nasal cavity volume. So the sort of tubing space inside of our nose, we can increase that and improve the airflow through the nose. So dentistry can actually help improve things and provide solutions. One study found that for every 1 millimeter of expansion, the airway volume increased by 2.4%. We do see these types of changes of increased nasal volume space from both rapid expansion as well as more slower, gradual expansion approaches. And it's not only about the nasal space. When the dental arch is smaller, the tongue may not have enough room to rest in the roof of the mouth where it ideally should be living. Instead, it ends up sitting lower or further back into the throat space, where it can negatively influence the amount of remaining airway space. So that's a big part of this controversy when people talk about the extraction orthodontics is we're allowing the jaw bones to stay smaller instead of trying to reverse and grow some of this space so that the tongue has a bigger home to live in and it doesn't have to overflow into that airway space. The idea that expansion can help this, it's not only about expansion. This can involve tongue ties and muscle tone and breathing habits, can involve tonsils and adenoids, and just kind of our normal posture. In so many cases, there's not a single root cause here, but it's something to understand that we kind of need to dive in and make sure that we're setting things up for best growth or correcting things when a problem's being identified. So if your child's orthodontist is recommending the removal of teeth, it can be helpful to ask a few follow-up questions. First, we definitely want to know, are these baby teeth or are these adult teeth? And we already went through how those are really different situations. And then when it comes to the treatment options, are there other alternatives that can create more space instead? Some orthodontic plans are going to focus on expansion to support the jaw development, and others won't. If these options are not being discussed, it might be helpful to seek a second opinion. Not all dental providers receive the same training in these topics, so it can sometimes make things that much more confusing for parents who are getting conflicting advice. Providers who do consider facial growth and airway development can be general dentists, they can be pediatric dentists, they can be orthodontists. The key difference here is often the additional education and the treatment philosophy they bring to their work. If an orthodontist believes that their work has nothing to do with sleep quality or breathing, they may simply not be practicing from an airway-informed perspective. At the end of the day, this conversation is not just about teeth. It's about a broader impact to facial development, to breathing, to sleep, and how all of this can really influence lifelong health. So before you accept that the adult teeth need to be removed, it's definitely worth pausing and exploring whether other options exist. Thank you for listening. Let me know if you have other questions, other topics you want to get clarity on. I'd love to hear from you.